Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am excited and pleased because today joining me is Cliff Biggers, who is, gosh, if you don't know his name, you don't collect comic books. So let me just put it that way. But Cliff, tell the fans your origin story. What got you into comic books and made you a lifelong fan?
I can tell you exactly what. A tonsillectomy. When I was right about 6 years old, doctor said you got to have your tonsils taken out. I had looked at comic strip. My dad was a newspaper man all of my life, so comic strips had fascinated me. I had seen a couple of comic books at other people's houses, but I never owned one of my own. And my parents said, "Let's get you some comic books." At that time, tonsillectomy kept you in the hospital for 3 nights, and that was back when hospitals were reasonable about medical care. And so they said, "We'll get you four comic books, one for the night before and one for the 3 nights after." I picked out my four comics. I picked out a little Archie because it was a 25-cent 80-page special. I picked out a Dennis the Menace for the same reason. I picked out a Hot Stuff because I'd never heard of that character and wanted to read it. And I picked out a Superman, I thought it was Superman versus King Kong. It turned out to be the origin of Titano the Super Ape. And from that point, I was hooked. The superhero book, I must have read those books 50 times during the time I was there and the time afterwards. And every time I found something new in there, that got me to that point where I was buying comics as much as I could.
All right. So tell the fans a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I have been reading and collecting and enjoying comics consistently since those first four. I still have a spinner rack in my office with those four books at the top. Spinner rack is filled with things that what I call it's my rack of inspiration. It's a total assortment of low condition junk comics from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, superhero, war, romance, humor, Charlton, Marvel, DC, Tower, Archie, any company I could think of that I would have picked up at that time. They've got books on that rack, and I just reach in and pull a book at random, but those four books stay at the top. Those are always going to be up there to remind me how I got started. I I also became a science fiction fan in middle school, rather. We called it junior high back then. And that continued. So I started doing fanzines. My interest in fanzines brought me in contact with a lot of people who would go on to become major creators in the industry back in the days when they were just fans. Jim Starlin, Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson, people like that, along with Paul Levitz, Roy Thomas, had brought Alter Ego back at that time. It was an amazing time for fanzines and semi-prozines. I started doing my own fanzines soon after that, both science fiction and comics material in them. Continued doing that for a while. While doing that, one of the many fanzines I did was a newsletter for the Atlanta Science Fiction Club. I'd moved to Atlanta in 77, metro Atlanta area. And through that, I met an eager fan who wanted to get involved in doing fanzine stuff, Ward Batty. Ward and I became friends, and then we became business partners. I had started in late 77, I had started ordering comics for Artie Decker, who owned a comic shop in Marietta called Dr. Nose. In 1982, Artie asked if we wanted to buy the store. He called one day and said, "I just realized I hate people. And I
So,
don't ever want to deal with the public again. So would you like to buy the store or I'm going to close it?" Ward and I talked. We brought in a third partner who had a science fiction and comic shop in the metro area, and we bought Dr. Nose in 82. The third partner decided to do something else a year or two later, so it became just Ward and me. In 87, actually in 86, we started doing a store newsletter called The Dr. Knows. And that newsletter was so successful that stores in the greater metro area began contacting me saying, "Our customers are coming in with your newsletter looking for books that you've published in there. Would you be willing to sell us your newsletter without your store name at the top so that we can put our store name in there?" We thought it over and thought we could do that, but if this is working for other stores, how about something national? And Comic Shop News was born in 1987. We did that every week. Plus, we did special, some 5 weeks a year, we did double issues. So we did 57 issues a year for the better part of 35 years. In 2022, we sold it to Dave Whitting, who's done a great job of continuing it. And I still continued on. The store's wrapping up its 49th year and about to begin year 50, starting in March. So we've been around for a long time. We're Atlanta's oldest comic shop. It changes your enjoyment of comics when you go into the business, but it doesn't take it away. It evolves into something slightly different because you have to read every book on two levels. What do I like and what's going to sell well to my customers? What do I think they will like? Sometimes my tastes are esoteric. Sometimes their tastes are esoteric. So you have to wear both hats, the fan and the retailer hat, to run a store. And we've gotten pretty good at doing that.
So, what happened in your extensive career going back that made you a Kirby fan? What got you into Kirby and made you such a big Kirby fan?
There was an issue of Strange Tales that it turns out came out about 6 months before Fantastic Four #1. He travels into an alternate dimension that looks like time travel and finds himself in a world where dinosaurs, abominable snowman, UFOs all exist. And he crosses paths with a tribe of angry Neanderthals who are about to kill him when he is rescued by a man who introduces himself simply as Crow. And this was Jack Kirby comic through and through. Anyone who has any doubts that Jack Kirby was writing those pre-hero stories just needs to read that book. Crow could have been a commandy character 15 years earlier. It's just an amazing book, an amazing concept. Crow was, of course, the first Cro-Magnon man who had overcome the Neanderthals and saved the scientists. But the dinosaurs, the spectacle of it all, the energy of the story, I was hooked. He had signed the story, so I knew what his name was. And I began looking for other books with that name on it. I was buying every pre-hero Marvel I could. I was trading with my friends for their pre-hero Marvels because we had a group of comic fans friends and we traded pretty regularly back and forth. So I was taking a lot of Kirby, and then in August of 61, I walked into the local Rexall drugstore a quarter mile from my house, and there on the shelves was Fantastic Four 1, which I assumed was another monster book. If you look at that cover, it doesn't scream superhero. Superheroes have garish, colorful costumes. They fight weird menaces. This was a monstrous creature with orange, lumpy skin fighting an even more monstrous creature coming out of a hole in the ground with a flaming guy and a stretching guy and a woman turning invisible. I read it and was fascinated. Yes, it's a superhero book of sorts, but it's a super anti-hero book. It is different than what I'd read before. The Fantastic Four weren't accepted. They weren't admired. They were feared. There was an ominous undertone, and they didn't work great as a team. There was friction between them. And I thought, this is not like anything I have read in my DC, or nothing was like this. And I was hooked both on the visuals and the storytelling elements of that.
So, you did the Fantastic Four for Jack of All Comics. Did you get assigned to that, or did you actually get to pick the topic?
Several people had asked to do Fantastic Four, as I understand it. Jim made the final decisions as to who would do what. And one of the things he said was, you are the only person who's asked to do this who's been there since day one, who read the first issue off the stands and picked up all those issues since then. And he was kind enough to give me a shot at it. And I understood, give it your best shot. And if it's not what I want, I may have to reassign it. There'll always be an essay for you, but with so many people wanting Fantastic Four, he couldn't guarantee, but Jim was very pleased, it seems, with the piece that I sent in. I was very pleased with the piece that I sent in. I really thought it captured a lot of what made that book so special for me. And in the process of doing that, I reread all 107 Jack Kirby Fantastic Four stories 1 through 102, plus the 5 annuals. Plus, I reread all the Strange Tales with Human Torch and later Human Torch and Thing. And I reread the Strange Tales annual, the Spider-Man Human Torch team up issue that came out, just to get a feel for what they were doing there. And it is a real eye-opening experience to read all this material consecutively years later and see not only how well it holds up, but how well it matures as that series goes along.
Yeah, I because that is one of my favorite things of the essay, and a lot of the Jack people, I'm teaming them up with as partners, and I'm like, oh, there's just no way I could team up Cliff with anybody else. He's doing a solo show with the Fantastic
Well,
Four
thank you.
because we did this morning, we did Commandy and Mr. Miracle, and that worked out really good. But I'm like, there's no way I could team
Yeah.
up with Cliff because there's no way that Cliff's not going to steal the whole show from whoever I team up no matter how he tries to be gracious about it. So like Cliff's going to get his own show. And the other person who got his own show, which we also taped today, Jack did in the
Right.
late 70s. And then he was like, he got a solo show because when I was putting the stuff together, I forgot to attach him to an email to the other guys. I'm curious, if you didn't do the Fantastic Four, what one would you have liked to have done?
And that is a good question. I didn't even list alternates when I first picked it. I would have probably stayed rooted at Marvel and gone for Avengers, which was in many ways what the myth of Fantastic Four was. It was Marvel's version of the Justice League. And Jack's run on that book wasn't anywhere nearly as long as Fantastic Four, but it's still there. My third choice would have probably been Forever People, because as Jimmy Olsen, Forever People, New Gods, Mr. Miracle, as those books came out, it was Forever People that hooked me the most of all out of those particular titles.
Did you find it daunting to do an essay on the Fantastic Four? Because again, you covered over 100 issues, 9 years of work.
Jim was very clear in his instructions. He said, I don't want plot summaries of issues. I don't want synopses. I want you to capture the essence of what Kirby has done here and what makes this work so important. And for me, that was an assignment I was thrilled to run with because it is important. It did change comics history. There would be no Marvel Universe without Fantastic Four. And that not only in Jack's work on that book, but also you see that in the way the letters columns quickly coalesce around that book. Early on, fans, and we're aware that a few of those letters were written in-house, but fans that I know who went on to become professionals later on, sending in letters, they're influenced by this. They're moved by the stories, the spectacle, as well as the humanity of it. And I think that's an important series. I don't think anything would have made the Marvel Universe if Fantastic Four 1 had not been there. Yes, Spider-Man went on to eclipse it as a bestseller at Marvel, but I don't think there would have been a Spider-Man if Fantastic Four 1 hadn't proven the market for it first.
So,
I will also add,
yeah,
I
go.
had read a couple of the Kirby Challengers beforehand, and even as a kid, I saw a similarity there that I enjoyed. It was like he'd taken the Challengers to the next level, and that was fun for me also.
So, how did Kirby's art evolve throughout his run? And is it fair due to the circumstance that was going on towards the end of the run that he checked out and was just more doing it like by almost like factory work towards the end because he was tired and burnt? Is that all that fair to say about all that?
I don't know about burnt out, but I think he was wary. I think that Jack had come to realize later in the Fantastic Four run that all of his creative work gave him nothing that he owned forever. And I think that made him wary. At that point, we have Jack doing portfolio art even back then that introduces characters that look to me like they very much could have been New Gods characters. And even then, I think Jack was thinking, why am I giving away ideas for free that I could own somewhere else? I think the dissatisfaction had set in. The stories are not always as good because Jack quit introducing new characters and concepts for the most part. And when he did, they were mostly throwaway characters and concepts as far as he was concerned, even though one of them in Fantastic Four 94, I believe it was, Agatha Harkness, went on to become a much major figure in Marvel history later on. I don't think Jack really thought of her as having that sort of potential. But I think Jack was stymied by the fact that Stan was getting a lot of credit as the face of Marvel and as the creator behind so much of this. Jack wasn't getting creative credit and he wasn't getting the money he thought he deserved as well as the respect. And I think that's for any creator of his magnitude, that's got to be disappointing. He wasn't the only one who felt that way, but I think he was the one who was probably the most frustrated by that experience.
So you would agree that his best work at Marvel during that whole Silver Age was the Fantastic Four.
In my mind, definitely. The Fantastic Four with Thor being a close second, I think that those are the works that define him. One of them lets him explore his science fictional side. One of them lets him explore the mythic side, even though in Thor he brings in science fictional concepts such as Ego, the Living Planet, and things like this. I think that he wanted to look at two different facets of his imagination in there. He does a wonderful job with both. It's amazing to see him develop and to see him develop artistically. If you look at those first, it is funny how your mind plays tricks on you. In my mind, Fantastic Four 1 through 25 was full cinemascope in comics form. And yet, when I go back and look at those issues, he is, for the most part, working with constrained panels. He's not working with huge, there's still a vitality that is unmatched in those early stories, but it's a tighter, more subdued vitality than what we see later on. Kirby begins to open up and flourish, I believe, really around the late Fantastic Four 30s issues, going into issues in the 40s run. The Doom at the Baxter Building, leading into the Inhumans, leading into the Silver Surfer. And then by 50, it is like his vision just explodes on the page. Panels get larger, they get more open. Kirby becoming bolder with his figures. You see a lot of the Kirby dynamics, the figures that not just in terms of their pose leap off the page, but in terms of the way he draws them, they leap off the page into the viewer's eye right away. It's an incredible growth as an artist. I think it had always been there. I think we saw clues of this even far back as Fighting American and some of his early Captain America stories for the Golden Age. But in Fantastic Four, I think we see Kirby at his most spectacular.
Do you think it would be impossible for Kirby not to influence the Fantastic Four even through today because he left such a huge impact?
And I think that you can't have a Fantastic Four without Kirby. And I think there is so much of his personality imbued into that book and into those characters that I think that there would be no Fantastic Four if you drifted too far from the Kirby concept. We've seen there were some times where they tried that. There was a time where Marvel was downplaying Fantastic Four earlier in this century because they didn't own the film rights to Fantastic Four at that time. Fantastic Four got downplayed as a book, and the stories they were almost like dog paddling stories. Nobody's moving forward, they're just staying afloat to keep the characters on there. And they don't feel like our Fantastic Four. They need the spectacle and they need the humanity both. If either part's taken away, they just don't come across as Fantastic Four. I was lucky enough to have a chance, along with my good friend Charles Rutledge, who did an article about Jimmy Olsen in the Kirby book. Charles and I spent a few hours talking with Jack and Roz Kirby in San Diego one evening, just sitting, Jack and Roz on a sofa in the large lobby, us sitting on the floor in front of them because there were no chairs nearby, telling stories, Jack asking us about our lives, telling us about his. Fantastic Four inevitably came up. Jack was very pleased to hear I was one of the original readers, starting with number one. And I will never forget the moment after we've been talking about what I liked so much about it. And he said, Cliff, what was your favorite issue? And I said, for me, it had to be Fantastic Four number 4, because I didn't know Marvel had a golden age. I thought Marvel was new. To discover there were Marvel characters in the 40s, like Submariner, stunned me. And Jack looked at me and he pointed and said, Cliff, I drew that book just for you. Now, you and I know Jack didn't know me then, but Jack, when he said that, it's like this became my book because Jack said so, and I'm never going to let anybody take that away from me. It was an amazing experience. Jack talked about his own personality. Jack saw parts of himself in both. He said, everyone sees me in the Ben Grimm character, but there's a lot of me, I believe, in Reed Richards also. And he said, I spent a lot of time thinking. I spent a lot of time reading. I'm looking at new scientific ideas and advancements. I'm fascinated with this stuff. And he said, I think, to be honest, I think Reed in those early issues looks more like a comic book version of me than Ben does. And I can see that having met Jack. It is interesting that Jack felt like a lot of people saw Jack as Ben Grimm and maybe Stan as Reed, but as Jack said, when I created those characters, every writer puts a part of himself in every character it creates. I do believe from those conversations that Jack had much more to do with the characters behind that series than a lot of people thought at the time. I think that we had that idea that it was a Stan writing and Jack drawing concept. The evidence I've seen since then leads me to believe that so many of those crucial story ideas and so many of those character developments came from Jack as well, because they come across like Jack characters and concepts. We see him doing this again and again in other creations of his for other companies. And I feel like you get to know Jack through those characters.
Do you think it's fair to say because of how Jack was as his personality and stuff that fans missed how humble and open and good-hearted and kind he was to other people?
Jack was, he was an incredibly supportive creator who wanted other people to be creators as well. He encouraged them, don't try to do me, do you. Jack was willing, of course, to do layouts for artists who weren't catching on the Marvel style, but he only did it for a little while. Then he wanted them to be free to do their own stuff once they saw what he was doing at Marvel. Jack didn't want to do layouts for other artists necessarily. That wasn't something he wanted to do. I think that we got little clues of that. I think even on that silly Mary Marvel Marching Society Marvel bullpen record, when you hear Jack, you can't help but the guy right away. This is a guy you can tell he's a likable person. The little interviews I read, and interviews in fanzines in the 60s were usually 2 or 3 paragraphs. They weren't lengthy interviews, but what I read, Jack came across as a guy who was driven by his own creative urges. He wanted to tell these stories. We all, growing up in that era, all of us who grew up, really wanted to embrace this concept that we were honorary members of this band of brothers who had gotten together and had a great time creating this comics universe. The reality is a little bit more fractious than we ever imagined back then. And it's it is inevitable. It had to come to an end. I see this, one of my other passions is Beatles music, and I see this being analogous to what happened to the Beatles. We had this image of these 4 lovable brothers by choice who played music together and lived together and everything. We didn't see the reality, and later on, life is never as good as the image that publicists like to create. But I do think that Jack's humanity came through, and I think people are harsh. Stan said some things about Jack that I think he said in jest about Jack signing his name to everything he could get his hands on. I think that was Stan joking around. I think it was an attempt to demean Jack, but it wasn't true. But it also gave us this idea: these are guys who kid each other, they rib each other, they have a good time, they seem to love what they're doing. We didn't know some of the creative disputes behind it. We wouldn't find that out until later. But Jack always comes through as the guy who wants to tell great stories and is very pleased when people enjoy them. There's no ego in the man at all.
You know, people always bring up the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby type thing, but also in fairness, when this all started in 1960, 61, nobody could have foreseen what the end of the 60s would be like, you
No
know?
way, but you are right. I
Because
agree with that.
last year I wrote an article where the 1950s was a kind of like the Murphy's Law for Marvel and Stan because comics in general almost went out of business. Atlas almost went under, and everything that could
Right.
possibly happen to Stan and Atlas happened. And the 1960s was almost like Murphy's Law in reverse, where everything was good. You
Yep.
say Fantastic Four, and now you have X-Men, now you have Spider-Man, and by the end of the 1960s, you're taking over DC, and nobody could have saw that. And
I think I remember, and I wish I could ascribe this to the proper editor, but because I don't remember for sure, I'm just going to say an editor at Marvel Comics in the 70s had said that one of the reasons Marvel was rolling out so many horror magazines and things like that in the early 70s was that they had seen that for the most part, superheroes tended to run in a 10-year cycle, more or less, 7 to 10 years, and they began to fade away. And Marvel was already trying to find the next things when the superheroes faded away. And it was a surprise to everyone that not only did they not fade away, they continued to thrive and flourish. Yes, they sold more books in the 60s, but I think the concept of a couple of thousand comic shops existing all over the country, selling material that most people are buying because they love to read it, not because they're expecting to invest in it, but because they love to read the books. I don't think anyone imagined that could happen. And I know Stan was very, as we talked about the fact that I owned a comic shop, he wanted to know more. Pardon me, I said Stan, I meant Jack. Jack was fascinated that I owned a comic shop and he wanted to know more about how does this work? What brings them in? What are they like? How do you deal? Because to him, this was an amazing concept as anything science fiction had ever come up with. A shop that just sold comics and made money doing it. And he was amazed. He was, like I said, he was fascinated. He was always asking, how does it work? I had a chance to talk with him several more times for various pieces for Comic Shop News, including just a few weeks before he passed away. He never lost his enthusiasm for comics. I also remember, and this is something that meant a lot to me. You and I both know that one of the inkers who gets a lot of flack from people nowadays, one of the inkers who worked with Kirby a lot and gets flack was Vince Colletta. Jack took Vince Colletta with him to DC early on because he didn't know what sort of work Vince might get at Marvel once he left. And he wanted to make sure he had a loyalty to the people who had worked with him. And Vince, he knew that some people did not care for Vince's style, so he took him along with him. I thought this shows a lot about Jack. There is a loyalty to the people he worked with.
it also reminds me on the flip side, when the Marvel method started, where Stan would just give people plots and stuff, and people forget that Martin Goodman was cheap and wouldn't give them any help to do anything. And on the flip side, Stan's these guys need to have work to pay their bills. It became an offshoot of that. Hey, go do the story, da da, and go do it. So it wasn't like a Machiavellian effect thing that Stan was trying to just screw people over. And it just was a natural process that all of a sudden we got all these stories going that we didn't do. So needs a paycheck, and that person needs a paycheck, and I can't write them
Right,
off. Goodman won't hire me an assistant until Roy Thomas came along. And not that I'm justifying anything about Stan, but people need to
right.
look at these things around the edges to get a full thing. It shows what a great man he is outside
He
of
is.
being the king of comics.
Jack never forgot that while it is an art form and a creative talent, it's also a way that people pay their mortgages and feed their families. And that was important to Jack. Jack is one of those guys who understood that if he didn't produce an issue for somebody else to ink and for somebody else to letter and for somebody else to color and for them to publish and then do it, somebody didn't get paid. So Jack always took his obligations very seriously.
And,
And
and and when he went to DC, one of the things he does is I don't want to do a comic book and take somebody else's job.
right.
That was, and I thought, well, that's how I wound up with Jimmy Olsen because I don't care what I do, but I don't want to take
Yeah, what's your
somebody's job.
selling book? Give it to me. Yes.
Exactly, because I don't want
Yeah.
to. And someone new to comics, how should they approach Kirby today?
I think that first off, you've got to enjoy just the sheer magnitude of the scope of what Kirby creates on the page. It's one of those things where people ask why I'm not a huge fan of digital comics. It's because digital comics aren't designed to work the way a print comic book is. On a print comic book, Jack is designing a panel, a single page, a double page spread, each of which has its own visual flow and influences the other. If you can take those books and look at that and see that visual flow, see how Jack uses individual panels and full pages and multi-page layouts to develop a look and feel for the story, I think it's one of those things that you will really come to appreciate. Jack isn't just a great comic book artist, he's an amazing cartoonist. He knows how to convey a maximum of motion, of emotion, and of action with a minimum required number of lines. He isn't a minimalist the way Alex Toth was, but he is very much, as a good cartoonist, he tells them with the necessary line work and not the super fine line detail that so many artists do nowadays. I think that's important. I think it's also important to look at the way he shaped those characters. Captain America to this day, it doesn't matter how his costume is reinvented for films, people think of that iconic figure that Kirby created, and you will find creators today going back to it again and again. Companies try to move away or modernize some of Jack's concepts. Most of them don't need modernizing. They just need, if you're going to work with them, bring to them the same sense of wonder and scope and grandeur that Jack did, and you'll do okay with it.
Cliff, we're going to wrap this up. This has been very fascinating, very fun. I appreciate your insights.
Always glad to talk comics with you anytime.
I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot. It was fun.